What do we have, George?
Henry Gaston.
Have we another George?
It would seem so, sir.
What do we have, George? Nothing better to do, George?
Oh, no, sir. We were just waiting for you.
Thank you, George. George, what do you have for me? George, do you have any pertinent information about this case?
Yes.
What do you have for me, George?
It's all good.
What have we, George? George. What have we got, George? Ah, there you are, George.
Sir.
Yes, George, what is it? What do we have, George? What have you, George? Ah, very good, George. What have you, George?
Sir.
George, is everything all right?
Sir.
What have we, George? George, what's the problem here?
Evening, sir.
What have we? Very good, George. What is it, George? Ah, very good, George. What do we know, George? Thank you, George.
That would be worse again, really, sir. You would see the weapon
Yes.
sort of coming towards...
Thank you, George. That's quite enough. George, I'll need you to pay a visit to the docks. What have you learned, George? What have you, George? Very good, George. What are you smiling at, George? George, have you anything?
Very little, I'm afraid, sir.
What have you, George? Very good, George. What brings you here, George? What have you learned, George?
Quite a lot, actually, sir.
You'll be fine, George. George?
Sir. Sir.
Where are we, George? What have you, George? George, how many hats do you have? What did you find, George?
Just a small kitchen and a water closet.
This could be our answer now. What have you, George?
Sir.
Keep looking, George.
Sir.
What have you learned, George?
Excuse me, sirs.
What have you, George? What have you, George? Thank you, George. What have you, George? I see. Thank you, George. Carry on.
Sir. Oh,
What have you, George?
well, sir, I've spoken to several people.
Excellent reasoning, George.
Thank you, sir.
George!
Sir.
What is it, George?
Thank you for the information, Mr. Lane.
What have you, George?
Sir.
Thank you, George. It's good to see you as well, George. George.
Detective. Sir.
What have you, George?
Sir.
What have you, George? Very good, George. George!
Sir.
That's very good news, George. Congratulations.
Thank you, sir. Sir.
What have you, George? Good news, George.
Indeed, sir.
Go on, George. What is it, George? George, are you quite all right? You look rather persecuted. Good bit of detecting, George.
Thank you, sir.
What have you, George? Very good, George. What have you, George?
Sir. George! Sir, what are you doing here?
I believe we've found our murder weapon, George. The shoes. Very good, George. You see, by paying attention to the smallest detail.
Oh, here we go.
Very good, George. Thank you. Good work, Crabtree. George, verify her alibi.
Sir.
Have a look at this, George. What have you, George? George, I need you to get me 6 melons. What have you, George? You were right, George. She was lying. I think you should ask her, George.
Really?
Really. George? What have you, George? Oh, I'm sorry, George. What have you, George? What have you, George?
Sir.
Right, up you get, George.
Pizza pie!
Anything, George?
Oh, sir. Nothing yet, I'm afraid.
George, what have you?
Sir.
That's an excellent idea, George.
Sir?
What have you, George? George, what are you doing?
Sir.
What is it, George? What have you, George?
It pertains to the theory I expressed to you earlier, sir.
What have you, George?
Ah, sir!
What is it, George?
Sir.
What is it, George? Thank you, George. Shall we, George?
Sir.
George, turn your head to the right. George? He fired me.
I know, sir, I know.
Thank you, George. And what have you, George? George?
Sir,
What have you, George?
Sir.
Thank you, George. George, that's evidence. Thank you, George.
There's more, sir.
What of it, George?
Sir.
What have you, George? That's a very good question, George. Thank you, George. Carry on, George.
Sir. Sir.
Anything, George? George, any sign of her?
Sir.
What have you, George?
Sir.
George? I'm sorry to hear that.
I could really use you.
I don't know, George. There's no time for that now, George. George, I believe this is yours.
Oh, brilliant. Thank you, sir.
What have you, George?
Sir.